Good morning, everyone. Welcome to day 2 of the Trees to Tap Forest Management and Drinking Water Virtual Conference. We're excited to have you with us this morning for our second day. Just a few quick reminders before we get going. We are recording, so the presentations will be available on the conference website and on knowyourforest.org after the conference. Please rename yourselves. So if you look in the participant list, you can click near your name and please rename yourself to your first name and last name, and also the organization that you're representing if you are representing an organization. And acronyms are fine in the chat. Please stay muted and have your video off until the breakouts, and please put your questions in the chat. We'll be monitoring the chat during the presentations. We'll have hopefully some question and answer time at the end of each section, and we'll also be answering questions in the chat throughout the conference. So we're going to start off with the sediment and turbidity panel this morning. We're going to have Dr. Kevin Bladen talking about some of the science behind the chapter, and then some linkages to on-the-ground implementation with a forest manager and a watershed association. So we're going to start with Kevin Bladen. He is an associate professor of forest hydrology at Oregon State University College of Forestry. Kevin is interested in natural and human disturbance effects on water quantity, water quality, and aquatic ecology. And he is a co-author on the sediment and turbidity chapter in the Trees to Tap Science Review. So Kevin, whenever you're ready.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. You can hear me okay, Shannon?
We can, yes.
Okay. Well, it's a pleasure to be here this morning and be part of this discussion. What I was asked to present to you this morning, as Shannon mentioned, was some of the results from the Trees to Tap chapter on suspended sediment and turbidity. An important aspect of that chapter was we were asked to review the more recent research. You know, the research has happened within about the last 15 to 20 years with implications for downstream community drinking water treatment. And I think it's really important to note that nuance because we're really limited in the numbers of studies, as you'll see, that have explicitly linked that upstream effect to downstream. And I think it's really important to keep that in mind when we show you some of this research and not to extrapolate some of this one way or another downstream. And I'll be sure to continue to bring that up as we talk throughout. Many of you, I know there's a really diverse audience, and so before we get into this, just want to make sure we're on the same page here in terms of what's turbidity and how is it related to suspended sediment. I think many folks think these two are very strongly related to each other, and in some cases that may be true. But what turbidity is, for those of you less familiar with it, just simply a measure of the scattering of light and may be due to the presence of different suspended particles, but those suspended particles may or may not be suspended sediment. So here in this example, in the bottom, this is Oak Creek, and on the x-axis is turbidity, the y-axis is suspended sediment concentration, and certainly we have a really nice relationship there. And so we could infer one from the other, but over here in this Hinkle Creek example, this is much more of a shotgun blast, right? There's not a really strong, tight, linear relationship between turbidity and sediment. There are other particles that may be in the water, things like dissolved organic matter, humic acids coming out of the soils that are contributing to either an increase or decrease in turbidity. And I think it's important to keep that in mind because when we're thinking about treatment, utilities really rely very heavily on turbidity because it's an instantaneous measure. But when we're looking at the literature and Headwaters research, a lot of that really relies on suspended sediment concentrations. And so inferring one from the other may or may not be appropriate depending on the location. Yesterday, I thought we had a really nice talk from Stephanie Reed from Lincoln City. And she spoke of the challenges that sediment create for treatment. This is a table that colleagues and I put together several years ago for a manuscript showing various parameters and what impacts they may have on treatment. And for today's discussion, focusing on this first column, well, if we have elevated turbidity, that's going to lead to increased needs to remove those solids from the water. It may require more coagulant in the water to make those particles sticky so that they settle out. It's going to lead to increases in sludge production, which need to be landfilled. If we have residual turbidity after all of the steps in the process, we may need to add additional chlorine, which can lead to increases in disinfection byproducts, which have to be removed from the water before it's safe for distribution. And all of those things can lead to concerns for the utility around compliance, and as Stephanie noted, overall increases in operating costs for our utilities. However, to what degree that is really depends on what utility we have downstream. Not all drinking water utilities are the same. And so this is just a summary of 4 major treatment processes. There are many more configurations than this, but the idea is to give you a sense that not all treatment plants are the same. And so here, the conventional treatment plant versus more recent technology and filtration plants, that conventional treatment plant is much more robust at treating high turbidity levels. Whereas these types of treatment plants here, we have a number of these types of plants here in Oregon. We have really good water quality, source water quality. Our forests have provided us with that advantage. But by going with some of these other treatment plants, it can leave us vulnerable in that some of these utilities may be challenged if they're facing higher levels in turbidity, which can then increase operating costs and other issues. So something important to keep in mind. Before we get into the recent research, if you're looking for a place to start, in thinking about, well, how does forest practices affect turbidity or sediment? A really good paper for that was a paper in 2005 by Gomi and others. They summarized the current literature of the time from the late 1950s up until 2004 on forest practices on turbidity and sediment in the Pacific Northwest. And what they found, not surprisingly, was a lot of variability from really negligible increases in suspended sediment up to 1,000-fold increases in suspended sediment. So while I would encourage you all to read that paper if this is something of interest. There's a lot of really rich information in there, but something to keep in mind with that is the majority of the research is from the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, where a lot of the practices of the time that folks were investigating are no longer relevant today. All right, so they're from studies where clear-cut sizes were much larger. We had little to no riparian areas like we had in the Alsea. This isn't how we operate any longer. Our roads were much more connected to the streams than they are today. And so I think important to keep that in mind as we look back over our shoulder at historical research, but I think it is relevant and important to do that. One piece before I move on, I think that's key is to think about the knowledge gaps that Gomi and those others, they laid out in their study. And for the sake of time, I'm just going to skip to this last one because we're thinking about linkages between forest practices and downstream and utilities today. At that time, now this is almost 15 years ago now, they indicated that future research needs to involve nested catchments to examine suspended sediment response to forest practices at multiple spatial scales. They noted that we have a problem in scaling these results. They actually looked for studies that had nested designs. They found 2 studies in the Pacific Northwest total, and the largest scale of those was 1.8 square miles. Okay, so for context, In Oregon, our median community water supply catchment size is 34 square miles. Okay, so that's 18 times greater than the largest study scale size. And I hate to break it to you, unfortunately, but I don't think we've moved the needle all that much from this study. And I personally think this is still a knowledge gap that remains to this day. Okay, so quickly getting into some of the newer results, though, with all of that in mind, we have some really rich studies that have emerged and allow us to compare the past with the present practices. I think they are informative regardless of the lack of scaling. This one, I think you heard about yesterday, the Alsea Watershed Study Revisited. It's a really unique opportunity globally to go back to a place that was harvested with old practices in the 60s and was now reharvested here in both 2009 as well as 2014. And in the recent harvest, because of clear-cut size limitations, needle branch was harvested in two passes, the upper portion and then the lower portion. This is a small fish-bearing stream, and so unlike the photo you saw earlier with no riparian areas, well, needle branch now had a 50 foot or 15 meter riparian area around the stream. And so here's now some of the results for sediment. So on the y-axis is suspended sediment concentration. On the x is the pre-harvest calibration period. Here's the first post-harvest period where the upper portion of needle branch was harvested, and then the second post-harvest period where the lower portion was harvested. This dark purple is Flynn Creek, the reference watershed. This has remained unharvested since that early study in the early 60s. We have Deer Creek, which was harvested in the original study as a patch cut, but now had remained as a reference. And then here's Flynn Creek. And so in that pre-harvest period, looking at these box plots, needle branch had our lowest suspended sediment concentrations. And as we move into the post-harvest period, we see those relationships really don't change. And so some decent evidence that our best management practices this go around really appear to be fairly effective at limiting or mitigating sediment transport off of these harvested hill slopes and into streams. And the advantage of this study is that we have that historical data. We can go back and look over our shoulder. And that's what this figure is showing. On the x-axis here is Flynn Creek, the reference. Here is Deer Creek, the other watershed, which was partially cut. And then the y-axis on both of these figures is Needle Branch. The triangles here is that historical 1960s study. The blue triangles here are the pre-period, and then the orange are the post-period. And you could see from that relationship, that old historical 1960s harvest led to 3 to 6-fold increases in sediment. They did so also in this catchment relative to Deer Creek, which really led to incorporation of riparian areas in the Forest Practices Act, as we didn't see that change with Deer Creek, where we had riparian areas retained for the first time. And then, comparing that with the circles here, the contemporary period, we see really those don't change all that much with our contemporary practice, and really giving us good evidence by looking back over our shoulder of how far we've come. Another study here, the Trask watershed study, also a recent study. We had multiple small catchments. There was an attempt to scale. Unfortunately, it doesn't relate to the sediment here, but we have some of that for some of the other parameters. So here, looking at our data, on the y-axis is suspended sediment. The light blue and this cream color are our reference watershed suspended sediment. This dark green and dark blue are the harvested watersheds, as well as the orange, and this red line is the harvested period. And so we see with all of these an increase in sediment after harvesting, However, important to note, these two, the blue and green here, these were non-fish bearing streams, so and non-domestic water use streams, type N streams, and they're small streams, so there was no riparian area. Well, here in Pothole, this orange one, these were fish-bearing streams and had a small riparian area, but we see a large increase in sediment, which gives concerns. Maybe our BMPs aren't as effective as we thought. However, it's really important to look at the whole picture. We looked at the erodibility of those catchments. So this is percent friability or erodibility with the highly erodible catchments over here and suspended sediment, and a very strong relationship with geology in these catchments. That as we move to more erodible geology, we're more likely to see increases in sediment in our system. And so really important to think about perhaps our practices in some of these locations. I mean, this is a reference catchment and a harvested catchment. They have the highest sediment concentrations in all of the study. Now, one really good study in terms of that scaling piece that we were able to find happened in the Deschutes River watershed, went from a small scale of about 1 square mile down to, I believe it was, oh, what's the Deschutes watershed scale here? I wrote it down, sorry, 58 square miles. So we're starting to get into a scale now that's really relevant to our communities and utilities. What these folks found is that with area harvested, so this upper figure is from the downstream large scale, the lower figure from the small scale. The gray bars are percent harvested by year. The triangles are the turbidity. And so what they found is as area harvested increased, we got increases in turbidity. They also found that as roads increased, this was something that Stephanie mentioned the other day, in road density, these white bars, as road density increased, that led to increases in turbidity. But they also found that as we moved downstream, we had higher turbidity levels. One of the things they tried to do is disentangle the drivers and say, hey, is forest harvesting contributing to this, or is it other factors? That became really difficult for them to do, and they weren't able to isolate that. I think if you were here yesterday, as Carl Morgenstern talked about, it gets really complex as you move down and through the watershed. You have other land uses that come into play, and really difficult to disentangle this. And it's not to say that while this forest harvesting activity isn't a player, it's just really difficult to disentangle to what degree they have contributed to this downstream turbidity. But a valuable study, and one I think would be really interesting to continue to follow, as they've also observed a decreasing trend through time, which they related to changes in the way that we've dealt with roads and routing of water more rapidly into our forests. These folks also corroborated the findings from the Trask study that we saw. The studies here on the left are on lithology that's more erodible. The studies here on the right, more resistant lithology. And so we saw anywhere from 3 to 6 times higher turbidity levels in those catchments in more erodible lithology. And so again, speaking to the importance of considering where we are in terms of practices. There's a really cool study. If you haven't seen this, my colleague Jeff Hatton and one of his students, they went to Loon Lake, and this watershed is about 90 square miles, a rich history of forest harvesting practices in the upstream area. They took cores from from the lake, took those back to the lab and analyzed them, and were able to date the different levels of sediment, and tried to ask the question of, hey, does sedimentation change over time, and in particular with the passing of the Oregon Forest Practices Act? And what they found was, yeah, actually there is a nice relationship there. they were able to go back to 500 AD and break up different time periods. But for our discussion today, we're most interested down here, the 1930s to 70s period with historical harvesting practices, much larger clear cuts, no riparian areas. We had some of the highest sediment production on record, but in the post-Oregon forest practices, that sedimentation rate in Loon Lake has reduced by about 27% and come back to approximately pre-industrial times. So a really rich study here that I would encourage folks to have a look at. So older research as well as the newer stuff also points to roads as being a major contributor to sediment. And so we looked for papers that explicitly dealt with roads. This is a great one from Yvonne Arismendi and others in the Trask. Each one of these figures that they produced is an individual watershed. And each of those watersheds had different treatments. This one, a reference where there was existing roads, but they limited road traffic in the watershed. We had existing roads where traffic occurred. They added rock to a couple watershed. They added new roads and rocked another watershed. And then the first box plot in each of these is the pre-roading period. The middle box plot is after the road improvement had occurred. And then the last is after road improvement and in forest harvesting and hauling had occurred. And so if you follow each of these across, we see small increases in some. We actually observe decreases in others. And surprisingly, the largest increase in sediment concentrations happened in the reference watershed. And so the authors here really attributed these trends to changes in our practices and really, again, moving water quickly off of roads, but instead of moving it off of roads and into streams as we did historically, it's moving that water and that sediment into our forests where we have very high infiltration capacities and that water can infiltrate and really limiting that water transport into our streams. Okay, and as part of that study, obviously, traffic matters. A little difficult to discern from that one, but this was another study from the Hinkle Creek area, a little further south. The blue lines and the green lines were road segments that they looked at where they eliminated traffic. There were roads, but there was no traffic. The red and purple lines was where they had roading traffic. And so while we see a similar range in runoff volumes, this really illustrated that as we have traffic and vehicles on our roads, that can increase that sediment availability. And so it really speaks to the importance of ensuring we disconnect our roads from our streams. Okay, and so the last study I'll show you, and again, this chapter, I think there was about 130 papers that we included. We started with a couple hundred, but about 130. And so in this very short window of time we're only able to show a few that really highlight some of the findings. So I encourage you to seek out some of these other papers if interested. This last study sort of combined some older practices to quantify sediment mass changes and sources with some newer techniques. They put these small little sediment fences in reference sites within the riparian buffer and in the largest area of disturbance, which is the general harvest area. And yeah, they observed sort of an order of magnitude increase in sediment moving off of the general harvest area, but really that fell out in the riparian buffer and gives some anecdotal evidence that maybe our riparian areas are being fairly effective at reducing that sediment movement to streams. But to corroborate that, they put these little Phillips samplers into the stream, which allow water and sediment to enter the front end. The sediment settles out inside of these things, and then they look at the chemistry of that and relate it to the source. And by doing that, they were able to show that the majority of sediment in these systems was coming from the stream banks, about 7% from roads and a bit from our hill slope. So just to wrap this up very quickly, Obviously, I think looking back over our shoulder, we see evidence that our BMPs have improved things. Certainly, we can continue to improve, but relative to historic, we've come a long ways. There's still a lot of variability, which is related to site characteristics and our approaches. I think scaling remains our biggest issue. Thinking back to GOMI and the key knowledge gaps, I would say that's still a key knowledge gaps. And if we're concerned about sediment and turbidity, we need to invest in some of these nested watersheds at different scales.
Great. Thank you so much, Kevin. That was an incredible amount of information to try and fit into 20 minutes. So we appreciate all of your efforts to kind of distill that knowledge that you've gathered. We are going to move on to Jennifer Beath from Starker Forests. Jennifer is a forester and outreach manager. She has worked as a forester for 23 years at Starker Forests, and as a fifth generation business, Starker Forests holds over 87,000 acres of forest land in Benton, Lane, Lincoln, Lynn, and Polk counties. So Jennifer will be pulling up her presentation. We've got a great conversation going on in the chat and some questions there. So please continue to add your questions as our presentations are going. We'll try to answer some of those questions in the chat. And if we have time at the end of this session during the Q&A, we'll also try and pull some of those out as well.
Okay, thank you. How does that look, Shannon?
Great.
All right, thank you. I'm not going to look at the chat because it'll completely distract me. Thank you for having me. I'm going to talk about practical applications to minimizing sediment delivery to waterways during forest management. Thank you, Shannon, for the overview of Starker Forest. We are an Oregon family-owned fifth generation business. We manage for wildlife and habitat, clean water and air, free recreation, and we provide approximately 100 family wage jobs to our local communities. I was excited about Kevin's last research that he mentioned in his presentation, investigating the sediment sources following harvest, because a piece of that took place on Starker Forest lands. So we're active partners with OSU and Nikasi and Forest Research. So what does it mean for minimizing sediment for land managers of working lands? I'm going to focus on two areas, roads and harvest. Within the road area, we have construction, wet weather road use and maintenance. And within harvest, I'll discuss briefly ground-based, skyline, and tethered operations. So first, there's a ton of resources available to forest landowners and foresters, forest managers on how to minimize sediment delivery. We have the illustrated manual of the Oregon Forest Practice Laws, Forest Road Management Guidebook, private forest landowners, and the Oregon Plan. So some of these are looking a little dated, but they still have a lot of really useful and relevant information in minimizing sediment delivery. Additionally, ODF has their official Forest Practices Act, and then also Forest Practices Technical Notes. So those are available on their website. They help resource professionals, often foresters or engineers, plan for certain aspects of harvest operations or road construction. So there's 10 Forest Practices Technical Notes that are available that I use actively and my colleagues use as well. I think I calculated that there's almost 100 pages of reference information in these technical notes. So just looking at the construction of a road system and building a road, we are trying to disconnect the water from the streams. We want to have stream crossings underneath the roads that are adequate sizing, that pass fish if they're in fish streams. And then we want to install structures like ditch relief culverts and drain dips, or maybe gentle water bars away from those stream crossings, so that the water connected with the road can filter through the forest before it hits the stream. So I'm going to show you quite a few pictures. This is an example of fresh road construction. Our right-of-way widths are fairly narrow. We have a long tradition at Starker Forest for building quite narrow roads. It's becoming a challenge with equipment being larger, but this shows a brand new dirt road that will be surfaced with rock, but you can see that it's been compacted, and there's vegetation that comes right down to the edge of where the construction took place. So there's things we can do, like the picture on the left where we have a flume on the plastic culvert. This is going to take the water away from the road fill and minimize erosion. Also, we can add grass seed and straw in places around waterways, and that can help too. This is a picture of a high flow. This is a new culvert. It's an open bottom fish passable culvert, and the road itself is on a kind of a sharp turn, and so that explains all the big rock on the right hand side there. But this is a typical winter flow for this culvert, and the rock can protect the road fill and the stream. So in some places, they've installed these sediment catch basins. This particular case is two pictures of the same thing, but it's just different times of the year. And there's a spring that comes out of the ditch above this road. And we just built this little dip, and it does a great job of catching the water and sediment and then filtering it. And then the water flows down towards the stream in this area here. During road construction itself, if we're installing, like for example, a fish pipe, which is what this is a picture of, we can create an earthen dam upstream of the construction area and pump the water around. You can see next to the pump there, that water is nice and clear. And these projects for us in the upper forested headwaters often last a day, maybe 2 days. And so we're not needing to pump around for many days or weeks, like some of the big projects that you would see in around cities and towns or lower areas. So we time everything just right so that we can get in there in the morning, start pumping around, and replace the culvert, and then open it back up again by the time the day is finished. It's really important to protect any exposed soils after construction. So this picture on the left, we replaced a bridge in the LC subbasin last September, placed grass seed and straw at the same time in September. And this picture was taken in January. So this is some really green grass for January. When you combine that with the leaf litter from the fall, we've got a real nice protected slope there. We also had a log placement project as part of that project. And then on the top right here, we see this is a waste area. So when we replace bridges or culverts, we end up with dirt and soil and organic material that's not suitable at all to go back into those fills. So we have to have a waste area that is a good distance away from the stream, that it's often loaded on a rock truck and hauled away and deposited in a stable location. And we also put grass seed and straw on that too. Talking about road maintenance, we want to develop a road inventory. We've done that in compliance with the Oregon plan. We started that in the 1990s. That's how I got my job. I'm thankful for that. We want to ensure adequate spacing of cross culverts to prevent ditch erosion. Check roads periodically through the year. Simple measures involving a shovel can often solve problems such as blocked culverts. Some of this is not rocket science. It's just about getting eyes on the ground and making sure that you don't have any problems. You can assess for maintenance during the pre-harvest period, during the harvest, and post-harvest, and then also during big storms. And when I started as a forester in the late 1990s, after we had a big storm, we were all hands on deck, running out, checking to make sure that our culverts weren't plugged. But since the Oregon plan and our replacement of many dozens, and for us it's been about 100 culverts for fish passage, we find that the culverts are not plugging like they used to. So they're the adequate size. So here's a couple pictures of a durable road surface. We have just on the left, it shows us a spread of rock. It doesn't even look like it was graded. It's just a light spread of a dump truck load of rock. So patching, this is called patchwork, patching the road, that works well. And then the picture on the right-hand side shows you the vegetated ditch here. So even as an engineer, the idea that things look brand new and clean is often appealing, but having a vegetative ditch is great for filtering out any sediment here. You can see the elevation difference too between the durable road surface and the subgrade. So this is a picture out of the Illustrated Forest Practices Manual. It shows the typical roads in Western Oregon are often crown roads, with the high point being in the center of the road. And this allows the water to drain off on each side. What you really want to make sure that you don't have is organic material in any part of your road system. It fails over time as it decays and causes problems. This is a picture of like a ditch water bar, and wasn't quite sure where to put this in the presentation, but I just wanted to highlight that when we have skid trails during harvest or dirt roads that we use that we want to close after we're finished using them, we want to be installing these water bars so that the water can be taken away from the road itself. Here is another picture of a durable all-weather road and vegetated ditch. The next picture I'm going to show you is going to be from the very bottom right-hand corner here. So there's some springs that come out of the road, and here is that picture. So we have lots of rock on the left-hand side, but the water flowing in the ditch is nice and clear. We're not hauling on this road at this time, so it's it's incredibly clear looking. So, but talking about wet weather road use, we have Forest Practices Technical Note number 9, and the purpose of that rule is to reduce delivery of fine sediment to streams caused by the use of forest roads during wet periods. The operators should use durable surfacing or other effective measures that resist deep rutting or development of a layer of mud on top of the road in places that directly drain to streams. Operators should cease active road use when the surface is deeply recovered by a layer of mud, and where runoff from that road segment is causing a visible increase in the turbidity of a type F or type D stream, as measured above and below the effects of the road. So it's not uncommon for us to pause our hauling operations during periods of wet weather, extreme storms. So moving into harvesting, we have ground-based harvest. Much of that is done in the summertime, but equipment like this on the left picture, the Ponce harvester, that can be done all throughout the year. You want to make sure that your equipment is not causing any ruts, and the equipment can have wheel chains or tracks to help minimize any ground compaction that you're going to have. The picture on the right here shows that there's a dirt road being used in the, this is in the summertime, so we can go ahead and use our dirt roads, but we'll just want to make sure that we install water bars when we're finished and close the road up, and possibly sometimes we put signs up or other methods to close off dirt roads. The picture on the left here does show a skid trail from a forwarder from a thinning harvest. So you can see that these machines, they put the branches from the trees that they've harvested into their path. So they're walking on that to create some distance in between the ground and to minimize compaction. So touching on Skyline Logging, the Skyline Logging is a series of cables using the equipment called a carriage to pull the logs up to the landing on typically located on a ridge. These logs are in full suspension where they're hanging. Sometimes we also have a partial suspension where part of the log is up in the air and part of the log is touching the ground. You can see in this picture on the left-hand side, the logs have already been removed, but there still is a layer there of branches and other forest debris from the harvest that is protecting the soils at this time. So just kind of have a comparison, a date comparison on this picture for Skyline Logging. The skylines operate in corridors, and the picture on the left is from February of 2020, and the picture on the right is from September. So it shows that the corridors, which look you know, a lot more evident in February, are much less so in September. We've recently been doing more tethered or cable assist logging, and we work with Miller Timber Services out of Philomath, and they are a active, sorry, kind of lost my train of thought there, but my main point here would be that there's some research that's been done. Kevin was even involved in this one, and several others from the Forest Engineering Department at Oregon State, that their research suggests that the use of cable assistance can reduce track coverage and reduce shear displacement, and thus likely lessen the potential soil impact caused by forestry machines. So while there are cables assisting this equipment, it's not like they're dragging them up the hill. A quick mention on landslide risk. There's technical note 2, which was updated in 2019. So when we submit a notification of operation to the Department of Forestry, they'll evaluate it for the applicability of shallow, rapidly moving landslides. So last slide, I see Shannon telling me it's time to wrap up. Make sure to follow the forest practice rules, use the ODF technical notes, make sure to do your maintenance. Don't be afraid to use shovels. You don't always need equipment for everything. Grade your roads, make sure your ditches are functional. Consider using geotextiles if needed. Stay off your dirt roads in the wet season. Pause your hauling if the weather's too wet. Use designated skid trails to reduce the disturbance. And properly close your roads after harvest. So that's it.
Great. Thank you so much, Jennifer, for sharing that perspective from Starker Forest and some of the examples from your forest management. We're going to finish up this panel today with Melanie Dunn. And Melanie is the Executive Director of the Coquille Watershed Association. As Executive Director, Melanie works with staff to build partnerships and implement strategies to enhance watershed health in the Coquille Basin. This includes extensive partnerships with both private landowners and land managers. So thank you for being with us this morning, Melanie.
Great, thank you, Shannon. Can you hear me and see my presentation all right?
We can, yes.
All righty, great. Well, in order to keep us on time and hopefully have some room for questions, I'll jump right in. I'll be covering kind of a watershed council perspective and how we work with forest land managers to enhance water quality for fish and drinking water. So just a quick overview of where we'll be headed. I'll touch briefly first on why sediment abatement is a high priority restoration strategy, how we go about establishing partnerships with forest landowners and land managers, and then spending the bulk of the time together today on an example project we have currently underway in Woodard Creek. So to start, I just wanted to orient everyone to our mission, which is, I think, very similar to watershed councils across the state. Really, our mission is to work collaboratively with landowners to develop voluntary watershed restoration activities that promote both a healthy ecosystem as well as a robust natural resource economy in the Coquille watershed. a big component of living out our mission as an organization is working on projects that improve fish habitat and water quality on working forests throughout the watershed. So why is sediment abatement an important priority for restoration work in the Coquille Basin? Wanted to start first, impacts of sediment loading from forest roads. That was touched on by both previous presenters, but from a fish perspective, if a road doesn't have adequate drainage features on it, sediment can go directly into the stream network, silting in redds and suffocating eggs of salmonids. Additionally, as it was mentioned, high turbidity levels can cause challenges for drinking water treatment as well. And then also, poor drainage on forest roads can have issues for forest managers as well. If they're not maintained, there can be safety and liability issues or additional costs to address a road prior to intensive use. So wanted to touch base on briefly about our partnerships with forest managers and landowners. As a watershed council, we do not own any land. We work in partnership with landowners to find win-win solutions for watershed health and working lands priorities. We implement a lot of and support landowners in a lot of projects similar to what Jennifer walked through with culvert replacements or large woody debris and road drainage upgrades as well. So here's just an example of a project we did with a forest landowner, upgrading a stream crossing from an undersized, slightly perched culvert to a buried bridge structure that greatly enhanced fish passage, as well as improved that infrastructure for the working forest. So with that, I want to just go into our project example here that I have. There we go. So about the Woodard Creek Restoration Project. Woodard Creek is a tributary to the North Fork Coquille. It's an important spawning and rearing stream for native fish, and it's also a working forest with multiple landowners. The North Fork Coquille Basin is also the drinking water source watershed for the city of Myrtle Point. And so we have that nexus with the drinking water providers as well. The limiting factors in Woodard Creek for salmon are pretty similar to what you find across the Coast Range, with a lack of large woody debris, some fish passage barriers, and high sediment loading exhibited in the basin. So with that, our goal is really to holistically restore fish habitat and water quality throughout the entire Woodard Creek Basin, by implementing priority restoration actions that address those limiting factors. And I really want to acknowledge our project partners here, a lot of in-kind support and funding from the BLM, time and support from Coos County Forest, as well as obviously the private timber companies and private landowners that we're working with on this project. So this is a suite of the actions we have planned in Woodard Creek. In addition to the road sediment abatement activities, we also are implementing log placements and some culvert replacements in the system this coming year. But I wanted to focus specifically on our sediment abatement activities in partnership with the landowners. So that started first with a watershed assessment where we surveyed the road network. And then from there, we installed barriers to restrict illegal recreational activity. As you'll see from some of the pictures, we've had some challenges with illegal OHV use in this area. And then this coming year, we don't have any pictures yet, but we'll be sediment proofing the Valley Bottom Road through recontouring the road, doing very similar actions to what Jennifer's diagrams showed, and then also identifying additional road segments for cross drain installation as well. So to touch base on our road surveys, we use the geomorphic road inventory and analysis package method developed by the Forest Service to document road conditions and input data to assess key areas of sediment loading. We knew going into this project that there was a significant sediment loading issue in Woodard Creek, but we didn't know exactly where within the basin that was occurring. So this road survey method allows us to really hone in and identify and prioritize what those sediment loading, where those primary sediment loading points are occurring at. Additionally, this area has high levels of activity of illegal OHV use. All these pictures here are documenting the some of that use, which is a big concern from a water quality perspective and habitat perspective, as well as a concern for the landowners whose road infrastructure is damaged, and there's potential liabilities with that illegal access. So I wanted to run through some examples of what our data looks like. I know this map may be a little hard to see, but this map is showing, after we've surveyed the road network, where there are stream crossings without a culvert. That can have impacts on the stream bed and sediment loading. So this helps us prioritize potential stream crossings to implement in partnership with the landowners. This map is also showing general condition of the road with how much rutting or eroded rilling is going on the road surface as well. Another example of an output from our Grape Road surveys is a map of all the ditch relief culverts in the system, and as well as noting if they're clear or if they're currently buried or blocked. This is also a great tool to help us prioritize where we can where we may need to go back in and replace some or install additional ditch relief culverts to ensure that sediment is getting exported to the forest floor and not the stream network. And then lastly, this map is showing with these red X's where there are some key points of the road that are directly that were observed to be directly delivering sediment to the stream network. Again, helping us prioritize. So this picture is a good example of that. Woodard Creek is kind of off to the left of the photo right here. And you can see there's this erosion coming down here and then going right directly into Woodard Creek. So this is an example where we can use this data to inform priorities for road improvement actions. As I mentioned, the OHV use was also a significant concern. So we identified points of access into the Woodard Creek road network, as well as identified areas to install barriers. And so this is an example of a tank trap with boulders that was installed in 2019 to prevent OHV activity. This is the same site, just a different perspective here. And the important thing to note is that it's important to strategize where exactly you're putting them, so you can try to eliminate folks from cutting trails around the barrier, which has been an issue in some parts of the project. As I mentioned, we'll also be implementing additional sediment abatement actions in the watershed in partnership with the landowners and the Bureau of Land Management as well, recontouring the road, as well as looking at installing additional ditch relief culverts in the system. And to fund all this work, we tap into a number of sources of funding. And I wanted to highlight the Drinking Water Providers Partnership. It's a great source of funding for this type of work, where the goals are to address fish habitat and water quality in a source watershed for a public drinking water provider. And I also wanted to acknowledge our other funders of this project: Bureau of Land Management, the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board, and then of course all the in-kind time and support from landowners and land managers as well. It's a big project, a big undertaking to really address this holistically across an entire watershed. So it takes a lot of collaboration and partnership to pull that off. So wanted to end just wrapping up a summary of some of our key takeaways from this work. First being at the site-specific level, there's often many opportunities to identify win-win projects that benefit forests, working forests, drinking water providers, and conservation. And partnering across the land ownership in a given subwatershed yields more comprehensive outcomes. Second point, illegal OHV use is challenging to restrict. It's important to strategize on the types of barriers and locations to install them to reduce chances of new trails being cut around barriers. Next point that we've really learned from this project is that assessment of the root causes of sediment loading is key to understand priority areas to focus resources on to abate sediment loading. And then lastly, again, wanting to acknowledge the funding sources. There are funding sources available to specifically focus on this type of work that's at the nexus of drinking water quality improvement and conservation outcomes. So with that, I will wrap it up, and hopefully we have some time for a few questions.
Great, thank you so much, Melanie. And we do have a couple of questions, or a couple of minutes for questions. Thank you for keeping us on track. We had a question come up in the chat that was a point of clarification. Is there a minimum vegetation area buffer along roads similar to a riparian buffer? If any of our panelists would like to take that.
If that means like the right-of-way width, it varies on the road use. So if it's a real low use road, it's going to have for us at least, it'll have a pretty narrow right-of-way width. But if it's a wider road that has bigger use, for example, like a 2-lane road, which is very unusual in our forest lands, you're going to have a wider right-of-way width.
Great.
So no, there's no exact requirement.
Thank you, Jennifer. Another question just came in. Would love to know if Coquille Watershed was able to get some good monitoring on the Woodard Creek project to show change in sediment to the creek.
That's a great question. I appreciate that, Barbara. We have not been able to implement sediment sampling in the creek ahead of time. However, we do have a sediment sampler and are aiming to get that deployed in that system later this year, potentially, or next year. Although we haven't had the capacity yet to deploy that work in that basin.
Great. And I think we have time for one more question. This one, would high sediment generation and transport during historical practices result in less sediment available for erosion in the next rotation? So now, that is, could part of the decrease with more recent practices be due to erosion from prior practices exhausting supplies of available sediment? Kevin, that might be a question for you.
I was afraid you would ask Josh's question. I've been pondering that. It's a really good question, and I'm going to leave him really dissatisfied because I don't have a good answer for that. But it's a really thoughtful question, and something that I want to think about how we might address that, because yeah, some of those really high erosion in some of those catchments, like in the Alsea that we observed in the past, yeah, to what degree did that leave that soil availability depleted for later erosive events? And to what degree does that sediment that got mobilized and is now in the channel actually contribute to the sediment we pick up and has just continued to mobilize and move downstream? And as the last study I showed, the Aaron Rachel's one, a lot of the sediment is coming from what's already in the channel and already stored there. And so I don't know to what degree that's already mobilized materials and how that plays into our current erosion rates. But it's a really interesting question. I'm sorry that he's probably really dissatisfied with that answer, but.
Sounds like it could be a good future research question for someone.
Yeah.
Well, thank you to our panelists this morning on the sediment and turbidity panel. We really appreciate your time and expertise. We are going to move on to our panel on wildfire exposure, and I'm going to pass it off to John Souter from Oregon State University.